We move now to the team's 4-minute reply speeches, of which the opposition team will deliver first. I may remind you there are no points of information allowed during these reply speeches. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let you know if you have 1 minute left, and after 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, I again welcome Michael Macklin.
The essential flow of logic we got from the United Arab Emirates was that the Death Star had a nuclear reactor. Alderaan died. Therefore, all nuclear reactors inevitably lead to the death of Alderaan. And that's simply not true, ladies and gentlemen. And it's not true because of the notion of provision, safety and cost, alternatives, and then finally an issue of dependency, which is brought up by my second speaker. So let's now talk about this first notion of the provision of energy. And the potential for nuclear energy to provide just that energy was uncontested up until Prop 3. But the response to the potential for this energy provision was that we can only dig uranium up for 100 years, and therefore we will no longer have any uranium. But what they didn't understand is that an example they gave us of the potential for nuclear material to continue to generate energy until the year 2152, which they tried to construe as a harm, is actually proof of the fact that it's just that. The potential to continue to radiate is why uranium will continue to have the potential to generate energy for the next 2,000 years. That's why everyone likes nuclear technology, that's why we still invest in it, that's why we want to ban it. So having won the notion of provision, where this debate really hinged was on safety and cost. So let's first of all look at the notion of safety, and this happened on 2 levels. Mechanistic safety of nuclear reactors, and then freak occurrence safety. On the first notion of a mechanistic safety, they gave us the example of some Indian state where they don't have regulation, where people aren't protected from irradiating materials and they have cancer. We concede to that harm. If you aren't protected, if there aren't regulations, nuclear energy does indeed have the capacity to be incredibly harmful. But the solution is to simply regulate, ladies and gentlemen. It's a solution that's been successfully implemented in a number of countries, in a number of first world countries that care very much about protecting their citizens. So it's obviously not inherently dangerous, we just need to protect it. That's why it's successful in the United States, France, South Africa, Canada, and even Japan for the most case scenarios. So mechanistically, nuclear energy is incredibly safe, safer than many of the alternatives that UAE would be forcing us into this debate. So let's now look at the freak occurrence safeties. And basically we can discern 2 possibilities: terrorist attacks and sort of natural disasters. And look at the first notion of terrorism attacks. And they would have us believe that a nuclear reactor, if bombed by a terrorist using conventional explosives, would destroy the whole of Europe or most of India. Something to that extent. It would have the same effect as a nuclear-grade uranium being weaponized. And that's simply not true. And their example of Chernobyl proved that, because the inherent distinction between conventional-grade uranium and weapons-grade uranium means it doesn't have the same capacity for harm. That's why an explosion in Chernobyl didn't destroy the whole of Europe. And then the second notion of freak natural disasters, they're just that, ladies and gentlemen. And if the line of analysis is that a freak natural disaster can harm and damage infrastructure that would then harm us, we would say that far more people in Japan are suffering from cholera and dysentery because sewage pipes blew up because of the same tsunami. Yet we don't believe we should ban sewage pipes. And the same analogy works for nuclear reactors. It's still safe. We should still use it. On the notion of cost, this was left out for most of the substantive speakers, and again, Prop 3 was left to make it. But we dealt with the fact that researching and developing new technology is inherently more expensive than buying pre-existing technology like nuclear reactors. That's why it's cheaper, that's why developing countries like nuclear technology, and that's why we believe they should use it. And then on the notion of alternatives, which was the final issue in today's debate, UAE wanted us to go to windmills and the like, and that's great. We think lots of people would like us to do that. But the reality of cutting us off from nuclear technology means we would fall back onto technology we understand, like oil, like gas, like coal, which has all the harms South Africa spoke about, none of which were responded to other than, or we would ban them as well. So because we had a proposition that fundamentally failed in their burden to prove that every country throughout the world should abandon nuclear technology, and because they didn't respond to the legitimate concerns South Africa raised, we should ignore the shaky situation in Japan, plant our feet firmly on the stability of the region within which we live, and not abandon nuclear technology. Thank you.
now to conclude the case for proposition and the debate as a whole, I again welcome Raishan and Shi.
Ladies and gentlemen, say no to nuclear energy because it is a disaster. And I'm going to prove to you why we have proven A, that it is so unsafe that we need to close all current plants down, and B, that it is not a viable investment for the future, under the following three key areas. Firstly, this issue of safety. Secondly, the issue of renewability and alternatives. And thirdly, the issue of making energy more accessible. So, on to the first thing about safety. The only response that we got to it from them was really that all of our points are contingent on there being a leak. And there was no leak ever since Chernobyl because everybody learned. Well, I have two things to say. Firstly, have you not heard about Fukushima? And secondly, sir, as you conceded in your third speech, there is room for human error, which is why some Indian country, which might add this extremely offensive, has every reason to believe that they could have this big disaster. And which is why, ladies and gentlemen, under the status quo, the government should not allow the chance of a huge disproportionate risk, and why we need to ban us completely. But that's just on the point of human error, which they have conceded. What about the points on mining, which are existential, that they haven't dealt with? What about the points on disposal, which they haven't dealt with? And what about the points on the threat of having this big red bomb in the middle of a country that they haven't dealt with? Because the difference between there being a nuclear disaster in Chernobyl and the explosion of a huge nuclear power plant by a terrorist in the middle of Pakistan is that Pakistan is inhabited by millions of people. And imagine how many more people would die even if your claim that it's not going to be as dangerous as a proper nuclear bomb, if just this nuclear power plant had to explode. So on safety, we believe that we won. But the only real harms they gave us of closing nuclear power stations was job losses. And that was interesting, because how they proposed to create safer nuclear environments was by making everything machine run. So we say that under your model, you have even more job losses because you want to impose these machines, which we don't even think are possible, and which we think are in contention with your point on why nuclear energy is cheaper, ladies and gentlemen. We think that on our side of the house, we give people who lose their jobs an alternative to go to. But your second idea was that we're going to use the technology to solve this huge problem that we're already in, when you consider that waste is such a big problem. And we say that the solution to a problem is not by creating a bigger problem. And we don't think that Germany, who has condemned their nuclear power plants, are in the dark now or are excessively unemployed. In fact, we think they pretty much like our bright and very economically prosperous. But on to the second idea of renewable sources. I was kind of upset because I don't think they listened to any of my speech when I talked about all my alternatives. They seem to be under the impression that I talked about coal and oil, which in fact I didn't mention once. We say that even without this debate, there's already a general trend moving away from coal and oil, which is why countries like my own currently have their main cities powered by Masdar City, which is a renewable energy plant. But furthermore, they didn't engage at all with my points on why our alternatives are cheaper, renewable, and more cost-effective. The fact that there's only cost of maintenance, and that is why, which leads me on to my last point, developing nations are likely to take this up instead, because their number one priority is cost. They don't have the expertise to run it, which are not needed in our alternatives that are presented. And lastly, they don't